What's up, guys? Welcome to the Coffee and Conversations. This is a mini episode with victims and villains. I am your co-host, Mark Pettit.
And I'm your other co-host, Captain Nostalgia, and we're just talking about all things Exorcist, it seems, this week. Um, but we're talking about this episode, particularly is talking about the Shudder original documentary, Leap of Faith, William Friedkin on The Exorcist. And I know that for me and you, like, we had similar experiences with The Exorcist, and you guys can hear our full episode on The Exorcist over at Victims and Villains, wherever you guys get your podcast from. But I also know that me and you are cinephiles.
Yeah.
And what did you think about this documentary? I thought this documentary was fascinating to watch and just to see all of the details of one of cinema's arguably like most definitive films.
Yeah, as a cinephile, not necessarily like a student of film, but I appreciate film. I appreciate good film. I think this documentary, The Leap of Faith, is like a must see if you've seen The Exorcist. Because for me, like I appreciated The Exorcist when I watched it, but not hearing or seeing William Friedkin's take on it and the production of it and how much went into it, like you miss a lot of that and you don't understand the value of The Exorcist as much, because today, I mean, it just doesn't hold up whenever you just watch it on its own. But if you look at it from the historical perspective of what it added to cinema, like it's undeniable one of the best horror movies of all time.
Yeah, and I think that you absolutely like kind of hit the nail on the head when you're talking about like there's freaking covers so much like detail in this, and I, like you, like really had thought that like The Exorcist was just kind of a movie that was similarly to like I guess like The Godfather or like Jaws, which are two distinctly very different movies, but are almost kind of revered as like these landmark movies that you have to see. Films like Citizen Kane, Wizard of Oz, like those are in the conversations as well.
Yeah.
And with the Exorcist, it's interesting because it is right up there with Halloween, Black Christmas, Nightmare on Elm Street,
Hmm.
Poltergeist, these movies that really challenged the genre into new things. And The Exorcist, when you think about it, you wouldn't have stuff like The Conjuring or Amityville Horror and other franchises that have, there's a cornucopia. There's an entire ocean filled of B horror movies that all circle around possession and exorcisms. And The Exorcist was kind of the one that really started it all. It was really the first film that I think, you talk about impact. This is the first film that significantly had people, like we talked about in our Exorcist episode, like wheeled out on gurneys
Yeah.
and were like passing out. And, this was really the first film that kind of like had that impact and showed that, film is actually capable of that. And what this documentary does is it enhances that. But I think that we've become so desensitized a lot to films that you really, it's, I feel like you have to be a cinephile or like a lover of movies and a movie buff to really kind of take into account the time period of which a film is released.
Hmm.
Um, and just the all the details that Freakin gives in here are just incredible. The fact that the very first thing that you hear, I thought this was interesting. He talks about this very early in the documentary, but the very first words that you hear in this movie are Arabic, and it's God is good, God is great.
Mm-hmm.
And it just immediately sets that tone right there for you that this is going to be stepping into a culture of not only ancient language
Mm.
and ancient deities, but this is going to be a spiritual experience
Yeah.
for viewers.
Yeah, I definitely think for me the movies that have impacted me the most are the ones that have affected me on like a spiritual level, that have like made me question things, made me think about things. And that just doesn't happen very often. And I can't imagine being a teenager or a young adult in 1973 and watching this movie for the first time. Like I guess it could probably be compared to when I went and saw Hereditary for the first time. Like that was the so far pretty much the only movie that has like affected me physically, where I'd felt ill like afterwards, and like felt like I needed to go home and just lie down because I had been affected in such like a physical way. And again, it's because it's kind of playing on that similar vein of like there's that spiritual element, and that just doesn't get played with very often in a very effective way. And um, I think Freakin' really pulls it off, and that's evident of how long it's kind of like stand the test of time.
One of the things that I think kind of turns people off because I was actually surprised when we recorded our Exorcist episode about kind of the negative consensus that I think we all had kind of like come to. For me, it was like this. I had gone in with this negative perception, and this documentary kind of really started to steer that in the other way to where I really kind of looked at this movie in a new light with this documentary. And I love there's a quote that he says in here. It says, it takes a while to get to the possession as well it should. And I think that, there's a lot of people in I think our current generation now that don't really appreciate this movie because of its slow burn. Um, and I talked about this in our Exorcist episode, but this movie to me, it doesn't feel like a horror movie.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like you are watching, what would happen if, a mother was faced with this reality of outliving her daughter, or what would happen, and what are the kind of emotions she would go through to watch that. Kind of almost comparing cancer to possession. Like, what would it be like for the mother to have this unknown certainty of, am I going to lose my daughter or not? At the core of this movie. And I think that a lot of people, when they go to it, they are expecting this conjuring or Amityville horror level of ambience and experience. And one of the things that Freakin' talks about so heavily in this movie was how everything had to be grounded right down to the opening scene. You just kind of get to see how this dig they actually shot in what I think would have been originally Nineveh. I can't
Yeah,
remember the name of
that's
the
correct.
city
Mm-hmm.
that they end up actually going in and doing it, but um, I don't know. Like, I just love his grounded approach, and I think that it kind of sets itself apart not only as a film of academic merit, but also at the same time other possession films that have come after it.
Yeah, and for me, watching the documentary really showed just like how sadistic William Friedkin was.
So
And I mean,
sadistic.
there's Stanley Kubrick and others that are similar to him who like meticulously plan every single bit of the shot, and like every little thing is just so intentional. But with Freakin', he's very much the opposite, and I think he even compared his like method to almost like sleepwalking. And to me, that's almost more terrifying than somebody who is so intentional with how they put together a shot, put together a film, and that it's just kind of natural to them that they would produce this, and a lot of choices that were just like within the subconscious, and they turned out like for the better.
Yeah, did you know, like, how did you feel about like the way that he treated some of his cast and some of the revelations that came in about that? This I it's not mentioned in the documentary, but during my research for this the shooting of this movie, the scene towards the end of the movie where they're actually getting into the possession, they kept that room so cold that you literally it actually caused it to snow on that set in
Oh my
one day
gosh.
while filming. And you have this 12-year-old girl in a nightgown in the entirety of this. We talked about it in the Exorcist episode, but the lady that plays the mom, she like permanently damaged her back from one of the scenes. They talked about it in this documentary. There's the pastor or the father that reads Father Karras his last rites.
Yeah.
Uh, like he was not an actor by trade, so
Mhm.
like
He was an actual
freaking
priest.
yeah, so freaking's like trying to like get the best out of his actor, and he's like, "Do you trust me?" Just and then just like open hand like palms them. So like you're basically seeing like him like crying because of physical abuse, and like it's just stuff that like just went on at the set is just insane to
Yeah.
hear him like just casually talk about too. Like there's no remorse.
Yeah. It was definitely a different time. That wouldn't have flown today, like at all. I really wonder what what would have happened if that was filmed today, like what he would have had to do differently. Because I know a lot of his casting was sort of just based off of his gut feeling, and got brought in people who weren't actors, professionally trained actors, and got them through those inconventional ways to pull out the performances he wanted. But it's like what kind of movie would we have ended up with, you know? um I don't know if it would have hit the same way if he had just all actors that could pull out the tears and the emotion in the same way. So I really don't know.
Well, even Father Karras is such a central figure to this. It's interesting to hear the story of how Jason Miller got cast, because
Yes.
Jason Miller by trade was a screenwriter who I thought it was interesting that he had actually attended seminary for 3 years and had a crisis of faith in himself, and then turned to screenwriting. Freaking had just happened to see him do a play in New York called The Championship Season, which eventually ended up becoming a movie about 9 years after the release of The Exorcist. But they actually had already cast and already like contracted another actor from that time named Stacy Keach. And like when they saw the
Hmm.
test between him and uh I can never remember the actress's name, but it's the actress that plays Chris. The two
Yeah.
of them did a screen test together and had talked about like he's like, dude, this guy like embodies it. Like how did you kind of feel about like some of his like casting, not only like casting choices, but just like some of his like really bold uh decisions as far as like going up against the studio.
Again, I just don't know if this movie would have happened today, and especially the way it would have happened. I kind of feel like it would have been one of those B rated or C rated movies that we see all the time now, because William Friedkin didn't have a ton of experience, and they were actually wanting to bring in Kubrick, and I can't remember the other act or director, and they both turned the studio down and kind of went with Friedkin because he kept pestering them about it. And I just don't know if it would have happened the same way and would have hit on the same level in this, in the current, if it was today. And yeah, so I feel like it has to be viewed within that vacuum of when it was, how it was. And back then, I guess this sort of directorial work was acceptable, even though, like, I feel like it's pretty crazy and would not fly today. But yeah, he definitely brought out some things in those actors. Again, with Father Karras, like, he was absolutely perfect for that role, but almost didn't even get it.
Yeah, I couldn't imagine this movie without Jason Miller. Even watching him do the third movie where he reprises his role of Father Karras in a quite interesting kind of way. But yeah, he just embodies this role so much so that you it's weird when you kind of hear these like Hollywood tall tales of like castings that almost were like, to me,
Hmm.
like hearing the fact that Marvel wanted Tom Cruise as Tony Stark
Yeah.
back in 2008 for Iron Man, like that blows my mind. Like
Uh-huh.
to think about the fact that we almost got a Tom Cruise Tony Stark, like, but to imagine anyone other than Jason Miller, I think is just bonkers. And I mean, at that time, we hear a lot of stories about this nowadays where like you have these like small indie films that like get really well received. The director writer gets nominated for Academy Award or like just stuff like that. We saw this past year with I guess I guess no. I was gonna say Uncut Gems, but I don't think the Safdie brothers really kind of garnered any attention in that way. But they've definitely garnered a lot of notable things. But Josh Trank's a great example of that. Here you have a director that started off doing a small budget independent film in Chronicle,
Hmm.
and then was having meetings with Disney to almost do a Boba Fett movie, and then did a poorly received Fantastic Four film. But you know before all of that happened, uh you know Freakin was a Academy Award winning director. He
Yeah.
had won for he has a background in documentary, made his feature film debut in 1971's The French Connection, and actually by a long shot, he says, even in the documentary, he won. So I think with that, even though it is kind of like ballsy and like they didn't really want him, they didn't kind of really know him at that time, like it is still a worth noting that he was a director that had that gold in his corner. So like he did have, I think, a little bit more pull than say someone like Josh Trank, kind of situation where it's like, okay, this turned a small profit, but it's no Oscar kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess maybe they didn't know him within horror, and that was the reason why they didn't want him to do it. And again, probably comparing him to Kubrick on paper, of course you might want Kubrick, but again, with how Kubrick directs, I don't think he would have handled this movie very well, and it wouldn't have hit the same notes.
No, Kubrick really immerses himself in his work,
Yeah.
and I feel like you can see that in 2001. You can see that in The Shining. You can see that in Full Metal Jacket. But it's interesting to hear Freakin talk about his directing style in this movie. He is a documentarian, so like when he's like setting up shots, he talked about how like he would never bring in the lighting person and his like DP on like they would never be in the same vicinity. So you'd have to like
Yeah.
light first and then have the DP come in. And his DP basically he wanted that documentarian feel.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, like, did you feel like the the Exorcist like feels almost kind of like documentarian like shots?
So some of that had stuck out to me, but didn't really it didn't really click until seeing him talk about some of the shots. And I'd mentioned this on our other episode, but there's that scene where the camera is basically on the bed pretty much, and like part of the comforter is like in the shot, and you can kind of barely see Chris and Reagan talking, and you can barely hear them talking, and it's almost like okay, this scene doesn't really fit, like it's not done well, and it's kind of obstructed, you can't hear anything. But then it does add that sort of natural feel to it, as like you're a fly on the wall in this room watching this very intimate moment between a mother and daughter. And so I think that it's captured there, and then also in the scene with the detective and Chris, like that scene is shot very much like a documentary as well. So there are times where you can really compare it to a documentary, I think.
And how did you feel about he talks about like his like shot and I love the quotes that he talks about here in his like regards to his directing style. He talks about spontaneity over perfection, talking
Hmm.
about how he would rather the scene feel spontaneous. And I talked about this in our the Exorcist episode, but I was the only one on that episode that had actually read the book.
Yeah.
So like I knew a little bit more of like Blatty's like full vision for where that was. And I feel like that spontaneity, like you can kind of feel that a little bit in the way that that movie's edited. Like
Hmm.
just like some scenes like feel kind of choppy.
Yes.
But it's an interesting approach to kind of want to feel more spontaneous, and the way that he's talking about making a documentary, you don't really know what the subject's going to say, you don't really know where
Hmm.
it's going to go. I think that's one of the reasons I enjoy listening to the Joe Rogan podcast, is because you just never know where the conversation's going to end up going. um but he talks about the fact that he's a one take kind of guy. He doesn't
Yeah.
believe in two takes. That's really interesting to me. I've just never kind of heard a director talk about that in that way, and I didn't know if you'd like how you felt about that particular way of shooting.
Yeah, that was something else that stuck out to me while I was watching it, and again didn't really click until he was talking about it. But I did feel like a lot of the scenes, the way they're edited, were kind of jarring, and you didn't really get context a lot of times for what was going on in the scene, and then it was like ended like basically as almost as soon as it began, like very short, choppy kind of scene work. And I I think that adds to the organic feel of it. Like it's supposed to be this, like you're almost like again like a fly on the wall in this room listening in on this conversation, and then you're jumping into another scene where Father Karras is boxing, and you're like, what the heck's going on here? And it's really, you have to, I think, watch the entire movie and potentially even watch it again to kind of piece everything together and really create a full story, which I think is what you'd have to do if you were a fly on the wall in those situations.
That to me kind of is almost the hallmarks of what makes a great movie. Jordan Peele, as a modern filmmaker, I feel like is very detailed in the way that he textures stories. Us is a
Mm.
great example to where that is a film that, even more than Get Out, I would say that Us in particular is a movie that is layered in such a way that you have to watch it like two or three times before it kind of like really makes sense, like what he's trying to say, for one, but also too, like all of the little details that he throws in the background. um I think that's what helps that movie be such a have such a lasting impression. um and just other things that are in the genre of horror. I think that that Hellraiser is like another great example of like a layered horror film. um but it kind of again comes across simple. And like A Nightmare on Elm Street's another great example of that. And Candyman are just these like really, on the surface they seem like very basic, but like when you start to like actually study them as films, you find that there's a lot of layers and a lot of things that the film is trying to say, that it's not just this basic horror film.
Yeah.
And yeah, so he freaking also talks about the fact of this being a very, he wants to set up these shots to be as simple as possible. um and even I love the fact that he references Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, where the detective goes to try and find out where Janet Leigh's character has gone and like where she's disappeared, and you just kind of get that scene of him like flying down the ground. Like it's such this simple shot, but it's
Hmm.
effective because of the way that it's shot. And they do a side by side with the Exorcist, and kind of like freaking talks about certain shots and how he shot them. And like I think that the simplicity, if you're not looking for that in depth, those more simplistic approaches to the filmmaking is something just really special that he's able to convey to the audience, almost kind of subliminally.
Yeah, and I think that there needs to be a distinction because with the way Freakin describes his decisions, it was sort of like that sleepwalking, um, kind of doing what feels natural to him. And even he said that there's a lot of things in the movie that he still doesn't understand. He just put it in the film and it works. And I think that is a very cool way of doing it because I mean I like Stanley Kubrick's work, but again, like there's a level of like pretension to it as well as like because he like every single thing in the shot is filmed and has to be a certain exact way. And I mean it works because he pulls it off very well, but also it's just kind of like if you're viewing it from that point of view of just it's so planned it doesn't feel natural or organic. But with the Exorcist, in the way Freakin worked with it just again that kind of organicness to it that you don't get in some films. It just seems so natural, and I think that kit is carried out in the tone from that very beginning shot until it ends, you know.
Yeah, so the one of the last things I really want to talk about before we kind of like end and give our ratings is the journey to get the music for
Hmm.
this. This is kind of the point that I thought was just the most utterly fascinating
Yeah.
and aspect of this. And I think when even if you don't know The Exorcist or you've never seen it, you recognize Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells song.
Hmm.
And one of the things that I just thought was so fascinating about the soundtrack was that he was like, I got it. Like this guy, like even if like he's like abusive to his cast members, like he has my respect solely because like he understood that he had a vision and he wasn't going to compromise on that vision. And he went through, I think the film talks about two composers um, that he was attempting to get the composers, and they showed some of the shots, like the opening dig. one of them was one of the composers was trying to get rid of the dig, and then you had another composer that wanted to get rid of the noise of the dig so that he could like put in these like ambient noises, and like that particular score just did not fit that opening
Yeah.
whatsoever.
Yeah, I liked that part of the documentary because it really highlighted his intentionality in some of the aspects of the movie. And I do think that the music, the score is so important, and that part definitely has to be super intentional, because they did bring up 2001 Space Odyssey and how Kubrick had a similar situation where he hired a composer, and the initial score that they put out was just not right, and they actually played it in the documentary, and I don't remember the name of the song, but the song from 2001 Space Odyssey that pretty much everyone could probably hum along to fits so perfectly. And the song that was originally the opening track, it just did not work. And um I guess there is that sort of sixth sense about what's gonna carry that tone. And yeah, it just has to be done very intentionally. And yeah, the score for this movie is probably one of the best, because again, it carries that emotion that um even if you're not a horror fan, you can probably start humming along with that song. So
Yeah, and to me, I like went up, and so I was curious like who had composed it, and it is like just a melody of different composers that reflect on the soundtrack. So it's, Mike Oldfield is kind of the standout, the landmark signature of this movie, because it's sandwiched very nicely, where you have Chris walking. That's kind of the first time you hear Tubular Bells, and then it's
mhm.
in the credits as well. And he talks about how like he Warner Brothers had like given him like almost 100 submissions before he like got to Tubular Bells,
Mhm.
for music that he could use for this movie. And he's talked about like he would put the record down, play a couple seconds of it, needle goes up, out,
Yep.
and just kind of like repeated that process of dropping uh the vinyl, drop it, pop it, out,
Yep.
and just he went on and on and on. And it's interesting that I think, uh, the movie doesn't kind of like allude to like the detail of like the final things that are used in there, but he talks about the process of like using filler music. And I'm always kind of curious about like how much of that filler music actually ended up making the final cut of the movie that we now know.
Yeah, yeah, so much of this movie is by happy accident, and it works. I mean, it works. There's no wrong way to make a movie. Like it, you just have to go with how you do it. And there are definitely successes out there that are successes for the differences in the methods, and I think that's quite amazing. And the way this movie has stood the test of time and is still like revered and imitated is amazing.
Yeah, this movie definitely stands the test of time, and I think a lot of that comes from Freakin's boldness and his just tenacity to want to bring his vision to life. And that's something I love so much about this movie. But what would you give this winding down? Where would this kind of rank for you on a scale of 0 to 5?
The Exorcist or the
The
Leap of Faith.
documentary.
Yeah, I'll give it a 4.5 out of 5.
Okay. I'm gonna go a little bit lower, give it a 4. Um, I've seen this documentary twice
Yeah,
in preparation for this. I highly recommend this. I feel like you just stole the words right from my mouth at the beginning of this episode. If you're whether you're a fan of horror, you're a fan of The Exorcist, or you're just a cinephile, this is a movie that you definitely need to check out. It's streaming right now exclusively on Shudder. Um, Mark, thanks for taking some time out to talk about The Exorcist.
no problem.
Where can people find you online, though?
On basically all the socials at Pumpy Skunk, so that's Pumpy Skunk. I post about the things I'm doing in my life, but then I also write for Victims and Villains, so you'll be able to find my latest reviews on there, but then also on the website as well, which you should probably check out too.
Yep, victimsandvillains.net. And wherever you guys are listening to this, make sure you guys hit the subscribe button on the podcast catcher, wherever you're currently streaming this. But victimsandvillains.net will give you guys access to the social media, where you guys can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Twitch, and Letterboxd. You guys can also that website will also give you guys past episodes, movie reviews from Mark, myself, and a ocean of just wonderful writers, truly, truly talented guys, where we talk about the best and worst in movies, music, and more. And you guys can also get access to our suicide prevention resources. And that's the reason why we create this content. We're all movie lovers here, Victims and Villains, but we do it so that you can know that you have value, you have worth, and that if you or someone you know is struggling with suicide, addiction, self-harm, or depression, you guys can feel free to reach out to us. Victimsandvillains.net has a library of resources available for you guys, and it's currently available wherever you guys are currently listening to this show right now. So that's gonna do it for us on this episode. You guys can stream Leap of Faith, William-Friedkin on The Exorcist right now, exclusively on Shudder, and check us out. We'll be back doing more mini-sodes later. So until next time, keep drinking that coffee.
Yeah. Bye, y'all.